Hi everyone. So today we're going to continue our analysis of Cambodia, going through the middle part of the book, which is stories 7, 8, 9, and 10, and exploring how they connect to the subtext. Beginning, I suppose, with lamps, story number 7. I don't know about you, but I find this story a bit odd. It doesn't really seem to fit with the rest of the book in some respects. It stands out. So, what do I mean by that? I mean, to begin with, it's the only proper story, really, if you think about it. I mean, in a conventional sense, so that it has a third person, omniscient narrator. The tone is very neutral, isn't it? Sort of this happened and this happened and this happened. What we don't have in this story is Fawcett intervening. The way that he seems to in every other story, pretty much. There's no shift of narrative plane here. And it's very authorial, sort of authoritarian. That's the point about not being in first person. So there's that, and then there's the subject matter, which is Buddhism. And I suppose we're invited to ask the question, how does that connect with everything else that this book is dealing with? So I think I can try to answer this as I go through the analysis, although I don't have any comprehensive answer, but it's all I can do is suggest what he's doing here. I think the key to getting into the story is the notion of a journey. Increasingly, we have the sense of being on a journey in this book. I'll talk to you a bit later about Joseph Conrad's journey along the Congo River in The Heart of Darkness, the book that he writes, which terminates in a place of horror. And there's a sense in which we are progressing towards this final story, The Fat Family Goes to the World's Fair, and its place of horror. So yeah, journey is important, and here it's a different type of journey. The two Tibetan peasants, monks, seem to be occupying a stage in a journey that they have undertaken. When we factor in Buddhism, we have a notion of what that journey is about. So, what a complex subject, but I'm going to do it in about 20 seconds, right? So Buddhism sort of starts off with this idea of trying to divest oneself of one's individuality, one's appetites and lusts and desires and will in that sense. And the more one divests oneself of that, rids oneself of that, the more one embarks upon this journey towards the extinguishing fires of individuality, arriving at some point in a bardo, and then culminating, hopefully, at the end of this process in the sort of blissful state of nirvana. The point being, one of the points being, is that it can take several lifetimes, in the sort of human sense, to accomplish this. So if you're not careful, you kind of get lost in the bardo and end up back where you started from. It's almost like a game of snakes and ladders in that sense. And that's what's happening to our two Tibetans here. If we go to page 102, this is what we're told. They had survived halfway down 102 because from the very first days they believed that they were dead men caught in an unpredictable bardo or netherworld. To the Tibetans, bodily survival had not been a goal. Since they believed that they were already dead, they were traversing the netherworld in order to be reborn. On page 104, we have more detail here about the nature of what happens in the bardo in terms of the Deva and Preta worlds. the hungry ghost realm, where if you're not careful, you become wrapped up again in sort of pleasure, in the pleasure principle, which takes you back to the beginning again. So that's where they are, and we have this idea of a netherworld, and I suppose we might then explore other terms we might use for netherworld. We could talk about an interim place. We could talk about no man's land. We could talk about a limbo, and that's exactly what the narrator does here. Page 98. When he did find them, this is referring to Surrey, he discovered that they had created, these two guys, a small pocket of bureaucratic befuddlement. They were in limbo. They might conceivably become permanent victims of the befuddlement that they'd caused. So we have this idea of a middle place, a netherworld. We've given it other terms, but the term that I actually really want to take you to is interzone. An interzone. It's a term that Fawcett uses quite a lot in this book, particularly in the subtext. And I think for him, it describes or connotes a place of fecundity, which basically means a place of intellectual freedom and stimulation. And I think he sees it as a very positive place to be, a very creative place to be. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but I want to now link the journey that the Tibetans are taking with the journey taken by Captain Surrey in the course of this story. Now, let's just think about Surrey. Who is he and what is he at the beginning of this story? He is an English military officer, an intelligence officer. From what we're told, he symbolizes, in many ways, all the attributes, if you like, of colonial power, imperialism, and of course we have the historical context here of that. We find out also that he's wealthy. There's a reference to his family estate. So, you know, you have a picture of a guy, right? So that's who he is, and that's what he represents at the beginning of this story. Then he meets these two Tibetans, and as a catalyst or whatever, they seem to trigger a process in him of undertaking a journey. So let's just look at that. If we go back to page 99, he's fascinated, he wants to help, and he decides that he's going to try to help. And so just below halfway on 99, it says, taking on such a task was more than Surrey had reckoned on. But the more he thought it through, the more attractive it became. The war had been a bitter disappointment to him. What had taken on, or been taken on as a just war, had degenerated into a return to the imperial aggrandizements that had set the stage for the war in the first place. Its lessons had not been understood by anyone in power, and he himself was no longer clear about what those lessons were. And finding these two men had delayed a decision he'd almost decided was inevitable, that the struggle against fascism contained no fundamental lessons for humanity, nor was the defeat of belligerent authority permanent. Perhaps the collapse into self-gratification was not an inevitability, and perhaps these men would reveal the ultimate truths the war had withheld. And so, in a sense, his journey has now begun. Page 103. During the war, I'm halfway down 103 now, Surrey had seen that the survival instinct lodged at the core of the human organism, and it carries its own logic. He believed that all being simply attempts to persist, yet he did not argue his interpretation with the Tibetans. And nor did he try to convince them that they were indeed normal, living, breathing men in the same normal world they had been born into. Their certitude and inner peace convinced him of the absurdity of such argument. And he also recognized that to argue the logic of his Western sense of reality in the face of their experience of it would involve a greater absurdity. That's quite a distance from where he started. I mean, this is no longer an imperialist. This is no longer a colonialist, someone who just assumes the projection of their ideas onto another culture or being is the right thing to do. He is no longer part of that project. And the journey continues for Surrey. And the years pass. Page 107. I think we're now, 1958. So several years now after the Second World War. Halfway down 107. Over the years, Surrey pored over any Tibetan religious texts he was able to locate, looking for the missing pieces to his puzzle. And in the process, he ceased to be a Christian, yet without ever quite converting to Buddhism. And so it is that Surrey has arrived, in a sense, at his own interzone, his own bardo, sort of betwixt and between a netherworld. But I think we're encouraged to see this as healthy, as a healthy process, a healthy stage in the journey. And it brings me back to this idea of interzone. And I want to just now see how this connects to the subtext. On page 93, Fawcett talks about the interzone. So I'm in the subtext now, page 93. He says, that's why I've chosen my artistic companions from the interzone. Between, and here's another kind of betwixt and between the first and third world, where an observer can still see the opaqueness of the global village and can peer into and perhaps decipher that which is taking form in the dark, oppressed villages. And on page 83, he actually identifies who these artistic companions are for him. And we have a list of writers here. And he says, I feel compelled to identify those contemporary writers with whom I'm aligned. And at first I'm surprised. He says, none are writers from the mainstream of English-speaking culture. Most come, as I do, from distant outposts of progress. And all are exiles of one sort or another. And that's another kind of journey, isn't it? A journey that many of you are taking or will take, where we leave behind, that which was our home. And so we have a list of writers here: Timmerman, de Grasse, Breitenbach, Naipaul. And I suppose the two heavy hitters, to use a metaphor, who are not in this list, but who feature crucially in this book, are Joseph Conrad, again, the guy who writes the story about a journey down the River Congo, and of course Malcolm Lowry, who becomes a central character in story number 10, which we're coming to very soon. So yeah, I think we've got this idea of journey, we've got this idea of progress, and of a kind of staging post, a healthy place of fecundity, an interzone where it's still possible to see the truth as Fawcett sees it. Once we've broken off the shackles, it's another sort of image of the cave, isn't it? The Platonic cave of working your way out, leaving behind the shackles and seeking for the light, the truth here. And I said the word light, and doesn't that take us to lamps? And perhaps we now have the image of what we need to help us get out of the cave, to help us see the way forward. And this is the lamp which illuminates. More generally, we should ask ourselves about Fawcett's fascination with Buddhism in this story. Because it doesn't really seem to fit. Or let's put it this way, I think in some respects, Buddhism seems perhaps to be attractive to Fawcett because it offers that prospect of escaping from the shackles, from the global village, the shackles of the global village. I mean, to put it in a facile way, these Tibetans do not watch very much television, do they? And that's the point. They're free in that sense. I think that's what he finds attractive about Buddhism. On the other hand, they're very vulnerable from the perspective of normal life and what it is to be a normal human being. These two guys are nothing but victims. And we should note that this story begins and ends with a war, as though that process never actually finishes. So there we are. I think that Fawcett is genuinely ambivalent, uncertain about Buddhism. And perhaps that's reflected, his ambivalence here, by the style of the story, which is different from the others. And perhaps we should note also that the story occupies its own interzone in this book. It is story number 7, with 6 stories either side of it, which are very, very different. And it is in this story that he doesn't preach to us. He doesn't intervene. He is, well, as I say, I don't know whether he was drunk when he wrote this story or when he wrote all the others. You know, so it seems to stand out in that respect and be quite important in that respect. All right, now let's move on to the Kerrisdale mission. I think like a lot of these stories, it seems pretty straightforward on the surface, doesn't it? I mean, we've got a guy who is some kind of an entrepreneur who's exploiting a situation, and it kind of reads as an obvious critique of advanced capitalism. Although we see from the subtext that Fawcett is clearly no advocate for the extreme opposite, which would be Marxist communism. If anything, it seems to me, the story suggests that Fawcett himself occupies perhaps an anarchist position, which may or may not have changed since 1986 when he wrote this book. But again, I think, as is the case with all these stories, there's more to it than there seems to be on the surface. And the way to find that is to explore the metaphors. Here, I think we've got a spatial metaphor at work. And I would suggest you understand what's going on here in terms of two extremes on a kind of spectrum. At one end, we can talk about urbanization, and at the other end, de-urbanization. So what do I mean by de-urbanization, and can you think of an example? I hope there's a really obvious one just screaming at you, and it's exactly what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia in the 1970s when they took over Phnom Penh. It's just a perfect example of de-urbanization. And Fawcett actually deals with this in the subtext, page 110 at the bottom here. When the Khmer Rouge took control of the country, they emptied the cities, evacuating the urban population and its refugees to rural collectors. The ostensible logic of the de-urbanization was sound enough. And he goes on to explore that. I guess the purpose here was primarily to separate people from the apparatus needed for revolution, for a counter-revolution. What is that apparatus? It's going to be the printing press. It's going to be the radio station. It's going to be those networks that people use to build up resistance. Well, they had no access to any of this because they were forced literally into the fields, and they were also separated. The families were broken up. Professional networks and friendships were just broken up. So there was a clear sort of political expediency behind this, and then there was some kind of agrarian economy notion at play too. So if that's the example we have for de-urbanization, the example we have for urbanization is perhaps given to us in this story, where everything is kind of built and organized architecturally to create productivity. And in a sense, the result of either urbanization or de-urbanization is, I think, for Fawcett at least, the same thing. It's dehumanization. That's the result of either. It's to divest an individual of that which makes them free and individual so that they become mere unit of economic production, whether it be planting rice in a field or tapping on a keyboard in this horrible little bedroom office that is described here pictorially. The result is the same, right? And I think that that the story operates as a critique of that, and therefore communicates the main thesis, which, to remind you, of course, is that elite groups take and maintain control by extinguishing individuality and memory, or fashioning a memory. If we think about this kind of cartoon we're given, it takes us perhaps more generally to thinking about how design and architecture affects behavior. Because there is a philosophy to this, there is a psychology to this, there is a politics to this. Those of you who go on to study architecture will almost certainly find yourselves taking a course in the psychology of design and architecture. I mean, just think about your day-to-day lives and think about how your behavior is influenced by or affected by architecture and design. I do this in the classroom and I get all sorts of responses. I mean, we can talk about the structure and design of a classroom and how, traditionally you have this raised podium, a lecture zone, and the students out there. There are imaginative attempts to change that now, so that it will be more like a pit where you have a lecturer or an instructor who looks up at the students, whatever. Think about fast food restaurants, okay? Which is sort of quasi-restaurants, aren't they? Because they don't want you to stay. So you sit there with your Big Mac or whatever it is, and you find yourself sitting on a sort of bolted chair in which you can't move, and it has a very short back, and it's metal, and it's not very comfortable. And then you look around at the garish colours, and it's like looking inside a Big Mac at these yellows and reds and whatever. And very quickly, you don't want to hang around, and that's precisely the point. They want you out. Think about a supermarket. Think about where the bakery is located. It's nearly always at the back. It smells good, it draws you in, and nearly everybody needs to or wants to buy bread of some form or description. So they've got to work their way through the shop to get there. It seems that the products that sell best are on the ends of aisles and in our eye line. It seems that we don't like bending down. So, all these factors are taken into account when they construct a supermarket and when products are placed within that environment. I can think of, lots of examples, but some of the particularly dramatic ones that come to mind. The Panopticon. The Panopticon was the creation of Jeremy Bentham, who died in 1832. Curious thing about Jeremy, he's one of our most famous classical liberal philosophers, along with J.S. Mill and others. Curious thing about him is that you can actually go and see him. He had himself stuffed. And I think it's at University College London, where there's a sort of glass case and you can sort of look at this rather alarming small chap. And the word is that the medical students there have had all sorts of fun with Jeremy over the last 100 years or so. Anyway, yes, the Panopticon. So it's this, well, why don't I show you a picture? That's obviously going to be the best thing to do, isn't it? So here we are. Pan means all, everywhere. Optic, seeing, right? So it's all seeing, Panopticon. This is a disused Cuban prison. And you can see the principle very clearly here. You have a circular structure, you have the guard, and it really only needs to be one or two guards in that central podium, just sort of wandering around. The point being that as the prisoner, you never know when you're being looked at. And so that constrains your behavior very effectively, that this is a model for prison design you'll see all over the world. Now, another example that comes to mind is this. Albert Speer was Hitler's architect and designed all sorts of sturdy things. Actually, the Nazis had this ruin theory of value. They had this idea that they were creating a 1,000-year Reich. And so any public building should last that long or longer. And so they tried to build everything with really solid concrete or marble or granite so that it simply couldn't be blasted or removed. One such structure was this Nuremberg dais or sort of pedestal that we see in the background here, raised, of course, on which the man himself would give his speeches, surrounded by his acolytes. And we see also here a retrieval of classical form. We have these columns in the background. And perhaps quite cleverly, we've got these searchlights just up into the sky. So the idea is that these columns sort of lead us up into the sky, into the heavens, as if carrying the message upwards to the sky, into the heavens, into eternity. It's a very powerful and effective use of design. And here it's all about pathos, isn't it? It's all about emotion, or whipping up the emotion of the audience. Another example that comes to mind is from the Franco-Swiss architect Le Corbusier, who died, I think, in 1965. And he had a very different idea of architecture as inculcating a kind of socialist notion of equality, that everybody should share the same type of spaces. And this was a sort of manifestation of the idea that we should all be equal, and that private property is in a sense a bad thing. This, believe it or not, was his plan for Paris. I mean, he was going to bulldoze most of central Paris and put up these huge monoliths as apartment blocks. And you do see all sorts of examples of this type of architecture across North and West Europe, and the UK in particular, I'm thinking of. But again, so we've got this idea of design, architecture influencing or affecting behavior. So let's go back to the story and just see how this is operating. If we go to the project rationale, which is on page 116, here we have it. Those who unfortunately slip beneath the normative lifestyle habits and habitations of middle-class life may not be reclaimable later, like pieces of equipment. I mean, I think that's the point of the diction here. So it's crucial that they be enabled to retain the, let me shift to page 120, the lifestyle symbols and habits that previously made them social and economic assets to our society. And so there we are. That's the idea of this guy in this bedroom office. He is being reintroduced back into society as an economic unit of production. And in the subtext 105, I think Fawcett tells us a bit more about his feelings about this. He says, in its precise theoretical definition, the science of modern economics undertakes only to determine the ways and means by which productive forces meet the demands for commodities made on them by society. It chooses not to discuss either the morality or the methods by which those demands are created and manipulated. And nor does it undertake to widen its subject matter to the ecological and cosmological questions associated with mobilizing the vast productive apparatus of industrial civilization. It has no wisdoms to proclaim concerning the distribution of human wealth, and ostensibly no opinion on the question. Fawcett was a town planner. I think he was back in the 1980s working in Vancouver, I think, in the town planning department. So you can see how he's drawing on his own experiences and thoughts about this. And where does this story take us to? It takes us to Leonard, who, like Howard and a couple of other characters in this book, doesn't go along with this, doesn't fit in. He's the oddball. And he resists. He tries to set a fire inside this unit, which is quickly put out. And the reaction to Leonard is to treat him as we're told here at the end of the story, as a dangerous psychotic. And so he's just quietly removed from the scene. This is what would happen in, for example, Stalin's Russia. It wasn't always violent. It wasn't always a policeman banging on the door in the middle of the night, although that could happen. Very often it would just be a kindly, seemingly kindly gesture of a professional saying, you know, obviously you need some help. You're not healthy. So why don't you come and stay for a bit in our clinic, and you'll feel a lot better. And of course, they never come back from the clinic. This is, it seems, what's about to happen to Leonard at the end here. And don't you think this is just about crowd control again? That's exactly what Fawcett is writing about, isn't it? All the time. This is another method, I suppose, of crowd control. Okay, through to Huxley. The Huxley satellite dish, a story that I think it's fair to say most of my students write about in their essay. And where most of them, well, that's not very fair, where some of them go wrong is in simply telling me what happens in the story. But I know what happens in the story because I've read it, right? So this is what you need to avoid, not just in my class, but in other classes too. You know, don't just say the obvious. Don't just give plot description. It's analysis that we want here. So how do we analyze this story? How do we begin? Well, whenever you have that question, of course, go for contrasts and go for definitions. See if you can find any weaknesses there that might help you get into the story. And one of the other things I've been telling you about is don't ignore the title of things, because the title can be quite revealing too. You remember the Bloody Chamber, right? So the Huxley satellite dish. Satellite dish, of course, suggests the global village, doesn't it? It suggests that technological net that envelopes us, which is the global village, metaphorically, which is so much a theme of this book and your essay. So I guess that's one of the reasons so many students write about this story, is because it's clearly about the global village and the effects of it. In this story, the detrimental effects of it. But what about Huxley? Why is it called Huxley? Now, whether there is a town in northern BC or somewhere in northern Canada called Huxley may or may not be the case. I don't know. I actually just don't know, because it just doesn't seem to me to be that important whether it actually exists. I don't think that's why it's called Huxley. I think it's called Huxley because of the reasons we're told in the beginning, 127, the beginning of the story. It's named after two people. One is Aldous Huxley, novelist who wrote Brave New World. Some of you will have read that in high school. And there's a note about it in the handout on Cambodia that I've posted on eLearn4U. It's a dystopian novel. And in that novel, people are given an actual drug. It's called soma, to make them complicit and happy. Well, there are obvious connections here with the effect of television as a drug, right, on the Huxleyites. But I think arguably the more important Huxley referred to here is this guy, Thomas Huxley. I had to show you a photo because the whiskers are just outstanding, aren't they? But what we're told is that Huxley was a supporter of Darwin. And that is how we get into this story. Because arguably this story is about evolution. And maybe the trap we fall into, just assuming that we have evolved as a species. Because when you start analyzing that and asking questions about it, as I do in the classroom, it becomes quite moot, that question. I mean, there are some, in some respects, it seems unquestionable that we have progressed as a species. I mean, when you look at the technology that we have. But when you start to factor in ethics, it becomes more clouded. I mean, that very technology enables us to kill each other in truly dramatic ways, which we couldn't do 2,500 years ago or 5,000 years ago or further back. It's true, ethically speaking, that we don't burn witches anymore, at least in the Western Hemisphere. We don't have terrible torture. But as a species, that sort of shit's still going on, right? In certain parts of the world. So, there are problems there. I don't know. I mean, this is a question for you to ponder, and I think perhaps that is the point. That's exactly the point of this story, to get you to think about that. I don't really want to say much about the story, much more than this, because so many people do write about it. But just a couple of things. Since I keep going on about metaphor, the metaphor in the previous story, I think I was explaining to you, is this idea of is a spatial metaphor. But I think here it's a mental displacement. That's the point. If it's spatial displacement in the Kerrisdale story, I think this story takes us to the idea of a mental displacement. The citizens of Huxley, because of the global village, because of their obsession with watching television somewhere else, produced somewhere else, which is Detroit, because of the way that titillates them, are not living anymore in Huxley. They're living notionally, mentally somewhere else. And I think the danger of that for Fawcett is that it makes them non-participants in Huxley. There is no longer that sense of a community. The fabric has been torn, it's been rent. People don't meet anymore. They don't talk to each other anymore. And I guess the inference here is that they're not going to be voting in the local elections tonight in Huxley. Chances are they don't even know about the elections tonight in Huxley because they don't even watch the local news anymore. They're elsewhere. That's why I think Fawcett sees this as dangerous. And when you think about the Huxleyites here as they're presented in this story, I think at least in Fawcett's mind, we have, in the sort of evolutionary sense, not progression, but regression. And that idea is how we're going to explore the Swan and Leda when we get to that story. Because I think for a number of reasons, Fawcett is nostalgic. He's nostalgic for a world that's been lost, a world that he sees as more complicated and more civilized. And it's an ancient world, a classical world. You don't have to agree with that, but I think that's where his thoughts are taking him. And that's why he's so deeply critical of the Huxleyites and of what's happening here. In terms of the subtext, we might go to page 169. Fawcett says in the subtext here, as a colonial, my instinct is that any village, even the global village, must have location and boundaries. Despite a rational acknowledgement that the global village by definition is locationless and omniscient. I've witnessed its effect on my kin, the effect of the global village on my family. That's what Fawcett is saying. Those who are by birth and geography the logical and announced recipients of the global village's benefit. He's talking about his folk up in Prince George, I think. I'm talking about people who live in towns and cities too small to support the illusion that they are cosmopolitan. For them, the global village exists in the sky. It's the satellite up there, right? Their satellite dishes point upwards, supplicant to receive its manna. But the manna, Fawcett says, doesn't nourish my people. Instead, it diminishes and humiliates them by presenting images of impossibly finished and stylish landscapes, images of men who are virile, well-dressed, urban and violent, women who are beautiful, sexually alluring, remote in their polished perfections. They are the perfect consumers of product, these television perfections. And my would-be global villagers ingest these images happily. But eventually, they click off their television sets and must face themselves and their environment, and they gaze at one another. And I think what he's doing there is describing what's happened in Huxley as a result of the satellite dish, of the global village. And then to page 195, that may help you too. And Fawcett asks the question here in the subtext of 195, what is it that we can see in the underworld? And I think Huxley here operates as a metaphor for the underworld that he's talking about. First, we can see that the return to liberal or to tribal consciousness isn't going to work. Individual consciousness, the IU world split that we've operated with for several thousand years, I think he's wrong about that, it's a lot less than 1,000 years, but anyway, was a response to the failure of tribal consciousness. The world grew too crowded for groupthink. And as cultures began to crowd against one another, the levels of violence rose accordingly. And individual moral and political consciousness gave people the capacity to think their way through situations, to create civil institutions that made better, ameliorated the natural violence of nature, even to make it go away. I mean, I think he's right about that. I just think it happens in sort of in the early modern period, from the sort of 16th, 17th centuries onwards. But anyway, this is, I think, an important paragraph here for Fawcett and maybe for your essay, page 196. Those who see the human species returning to a state of tribal consciousness, and the proponents of global village are foremost among them, fail to recognize that every outbreak of genocide in this century has coincided with the propagandizing of tribal consciousness. Nazi Germany is the most obvious example. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge xenophobia is another. And I think, I'm just conjecturing here, but I think that that would be Fawcett's reaction to the populism that seems to be pervading the Western Hemisphere today, both in America and you know, back in Western Europe and Eastern Europe too. So there we are. Again, I think a story which seems pretty simple on its surface has a bit more going on underneath. And that brings me, at least for today, to the final story that I want to turn to, which is the one entitled Malcolm Lowry and the Trojan Horse. For me, the most interesting story, and again, the most important story in the book, but I think that is just me. But let me take you through it, at least that's how I see it. We've got a Trojan horse here. We've got the Greek-Trojan War that Homer writes about, and I'm assuming you kind of know about that. We have Helen, who's kind of kidnapped, maybe complicit, who knows, but she's taken to Troy, and the Greeks are offended by this, and so they create this huge army and fleet and lay siege to Troy in a war that takes several years. Eventually, the Greeks succeed because of a device, which is the Trojan horse. And let me give you a picture of it here. Fabulous picture, this, isn't it? Don't you think? I think this is actually from the film Troy. And so what happens is that the Greeks manage to hide some soldiers inside this structure of a horse. They leave it on the beach as if an offering to the gods, and get in their ships and leave. So it looks as though they've given up. And the Trojans come out and they see the horse and they bring it inside. And of course, during the nighttime, the soldiers inside manage to escape from the structure. And then they open the walls, the gates of the walls. And of course, the fleet has returned overnight. And this is how the Greeks win the war. So that's what this story is about. But I think to enter the story and what's going on here, I want to give you, take you through a clinical test for autism that you can give very young children around the age of 3-ish. So let me kind of talk you through. What you do is you sit down at a table with a big teddy bear and a little teddy bear, and you have lots of pens and coloring things and rulers and paper and whatever. So you're just playing with the child, with the teddy bears, drawing whatever shit that you want to do, right? So then you say to the child, big teddy bear is feeling tired. So shall we just take big teddy bear out of the room for a bit? So the child says yes. And so you pick up big teddy bear and you go to the door, you open the door, you put big teddy bear outside the room, close the door, come back in, and then you carry on playing with the child with little teddy bear. And then after a bit, you say to the child, little teddy bear wants to play a trick on big teddy bear. Little teddy bear is going to hide the ruler. So you take the ruler with little teddy bear and you open a drawer and you put the ruler inside the drawer and you close it. And then you carry on playing with little teddy bear, right? Give it a few more minutes. And then you ask the child, shall we bring big teddy bear back into the room? Yeah. And of course the child says, yeah, let's bring him back. So you go to the door, but just before you open the door, you turn to the child and you ask, where does big teddy bear think the ruler is? And if the child says in the drawer, you know you've got a problem. You know you've got a problem. So, what am I trying to say here? I'm not trying to say that the Trojans are autistic. Far from it. But they see the world in a very simplistic way, almost metaphorically autistic. Autism is a very complicated topic, and some of you will have studied it. And I don't profess any knowledge in that field at all. But what you have with a child that, for example, fails that little test is a mind that is not yet, at least, able to put itself in two places at the same time. Because if the child was able to see the world through Big Teddy Bear's eyes outside the room, then of course Big Teddy Bear has no knowledge that the ruler is being hidden, right? But the child can't do that yet, at least. And on the one hand, that means the child is incredibly naive and vulnerable, but also in a kind of wonderful way, the child is incapable of deception, of mendacity, of lying. And I think that's what Fawcett is kind of getting at here when he talks about the Greek commander, Odysseus. So he says at the bottom of 145, try looking at the Trojan horse in a different way. First of all, it was an invention of Odysseus, the most cunning of the Greek warrior chieftains. To invent the horse, he had to put his mind in two places at once. This is exactly what I'm trying to suggest to you. And this had never been done before. So in those days, human beings still thought of themselves as part of nature. In order to conceive a trick like the Trojan horse, Odysseus had to create and operates the concept that human consciousness is an entity distinct and separate from nature outside its laws. And by doing this, he transformed the gods that both the Greeks and Trojans worshipped. So easy for us to understand what was going on in Odysseus' mind, but not for the Trojans. For them, material reality, objects, processes, people were inseparable in those days, part of a continuum linked by the metaphors of nature. This was one of the most interesting things I discovered as a student, was the way in which the very notion of what it is to be an individual is actually quite a recent invention or construct. That's what I was saying a bit earlier when I was arguing with Fawcett, because I think the invention of individualism is almost a 15th, 16th, 17th century creation of the Enlightenment, of the work of Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau and others. It's the idea of self-interest is not something you encounter in the classical ancient world. They didn't have a word for rights back then. And you can't have a notion of rights unless you have a notion of individual, right? They go together. So this is quite fascinating, and I think this is what Fawcett is exploring here, the idea that the field of vision of what it was to identify oneself as a human being was quite different back then. It's very difficult for us to access or recover or understand. So to try and capture what's going on in the story and to bring together what I've been saying, let's imagine a Trojan, who gets up in the morning and stands on the walls of Troy looking out and sees the sun shining and the crops growing and just assumes all is well and the gods are happy. A few weeks later gets up, looks out across the walls and sees crops dying and the seas are rough and the gods are unhappy, and just takes that as read. Gets up another day, sees a bloody great horse standing there on the sand with a sign on it saying gift to the gods, and thinks, okay, that's what it must be, right? Let's bring it in, boys. What else could it be? It's that kind of unmediated interaction with nature and the world that made the Trojans so vulnerable. Now I say Trojan horse to you, and it's a metaphor, right? You think automatically, I imagine you think automatically, not of the Greek wars and ancient classical history, hopefully not Brad Pitt in that film. What you're thinking of is a computer virus, right? Because that is what the Trojan horse has become for us now, and a virus that operates in exactly the same way, duplicitous. It seems innocent, we click it, Trojans that we are, and into our world the virus comes, or the malware. All right, so we're getting to Malcolm Lowry. Because, as you remember from this story, we enter this kind of dreamscape where the narrator, who seems to be Fawcett, we can't be sure, but it seems to be Fawcett, encounters Lowry on Gabriola Island. So, who was Lowry? Well, he is probably the most important exile writer and literary companion of Fawcett, referred to in this book. English, from a fairly wealthy family, had a difficult kind of upbringing, left university, I think joined the Navy for a while, ended up in Canada, actually ended up here in Vancouver in Dollarton. Some of you will know Dollarton on the North Shore. And had a little cabin on the waterfront. In fact, if you know Kate's Park in North Vancouver, there's a little trail there called the Malcolm Lowry Trail. So you can walk along it, and then you'll find a little plaque which says this is where Malcolm Lowry had his hut. And so there he was, living, as it were, literally in an interzone between water and land. I've got a picture of him here, which I think is really cool. Here he is. Looks like a happy little badger there, doesn't he? And I think that's the hut in Dollerton. And he's got the two most important things in his life there in his hands. A novel and a bottle of booze. It was in Dollerton that he completed, I think, one of the greatest novels ever written, Under the Volcano. So do check that out if you're interested in literature. It's absolutely fabulous. There's a reference to it here on 148 at the top, and then under the bullet point, Fawcett tells us a bit about Lowry. Well, at the top here is quite funny. He says he wrote one great novel, Under the Volcano. He also wrote several very bad novels, all of them, like himself, beloved of hard drinkers. Lowry was also a first-rate drunk. Arguably, he was better at drinking than at writing. And then under the bullet point here it says Lowry's problem was that the impulses that made him write were the same ones that made him drink. And there's some very good writing on these 2 pages. He explores and describes Lowry in a very metaphoric way. And Lowry had a very tragic life, which ended in a kind of drink-sodden suicide or death. We're not sure. You can Google that yourself and research it. But anyway, here he is in this story. So now let's just progress to the kind of interchange that they have. So page 160, please. Lowry says, in this drunken dreamscape, third of the way down, let's begin by saying that the Trojan horse was a metaphor, one that changed the world. And Fawcett replies, well, I've already got that far. But it was a metaphor that backfired, wasn't it? And they continue on. And then Fawcett says the archaeological record indicates that the walls of Troy were probably breached by an earthquake and not by any military action. And Lowry says, well, that's as maybe. Ancient history is largely conjecture. It's the metaphors it provides that count. So let me tell you about the personal Trojan horse, the one I fell for, and most of my generation of writers. What was that? The novel. The novel? Look at it, says Lowry. Any good novel creates a symbolic landscape in which metaphors can create emotions or release trapped ones. People need that. We're all of us far too repressed. A great novel releases great emotions, breaks open the walls of rational consciousness, just as the Trojan horse broke open the walls of another kind of consciousness. This is why I teach literature. This is why I don't teach Harry Potter. Don't get me wrong, I wish I'd written Harry Potter. It's absolutely brilliant the way it's put together. And I think it is fair to say that for young minds, it can operate in the way that they're talking about here as a Trojan horse. But as we become adults, we need to find other texts, arguably, which will do exactly that. Release these emotions, break the walls of our consciousness, as if it were a Trojan horse. Okay, so Fawcett's response is that the novel isn't going to work anymore as a Trojan horse. He says here on page 163, towards the bottom, the novel has become part of the conspiracy of lies and irrelevance that is using up the planet and threatening daily to turn us all into a heap of radioactive debris. In other words, it's just turning us into, it's part of that entertainment culture which turns us into Huxleyites. This is Fawcett's view of the novel. So he's in search of another Trojan horse. Okay, so we're on the next page, 164. So Lowry says, well, let's go back to you then. What's your metaphor? And Fawcett's response is, my metaphor is either the global village or its progenitor, the Trojan horse. So I'm trying to see the one through the other. Or to put it another way to you, Fawcett's metaphor and Trojan horse is this book, Cambodia. This is the Trojan horse that he's sending out into society, and then I suppose I am sending into the classroom, designed to penetrate the walls of your consciousness. That's, I think, the project here. That's what Fawcett is up to. There's a reference, once again, to the interzone, but now we're in the story. 165 here. Lowry says, I lived in the interzones in Dollarton. I was literally atop the primeval ooze, that little hut I showed you. And then we get to this final page, another reference to the interzones at the top. And then this extraordinary ending to the story. Initially confusing, but I think it's actually quite clever. We have these two guys lying, it seems, on the beach of Gabriola, drunk, or drunk-ish, at nighttime. And they look up into the sky, and they see a star, but it's moving in a regular way. It turns out to be a satellite. So there we are. That's the representation of the sort of global village up there in the sky, the net that surrounds us all. And then this bloody cougar shows up, right? And you read it for the first time and think, what the hell is going on here with this cougar? A cougar stood behind us, no more than a few yards away. I moved slowly, until I was getting away from it. But Lowry reaches out for it. So what is going on here? What could a cougar be? And what is its function in this story and in this book? Let's just break it down. So what is a cougar? Bloody big cat, right? Dangerous cat, at least to us, can be. A predator. Okay, but let's now think of the cougar as a metaphor. And what I think we might have here is that the cougar is a metaphor for the power of metaphor. That's what I think it is here. A metaphor for the power of metaphor. The point being that if you are not careful and aware, you are vulnerable. Just as you are vulnerable to a cougar, you are vulnerable to metaphors, which can come into your lives like Trojan horses without you being aware of it. If you are aware, and more fundamentally here, I'm talking about aware of language, of how metaphors operate in language in your lives, you are no longer vulnerable. That's the point at the end here. As if the animal knew him, it padded across the rocks past me and lay down beside him in an heraldic pose. This is what the metaphor gives us, he said, stroking the cougar's tawny back. We still have this because, of course, once you've tamed metaphors, you can now use them. Finally, today, I want to take you back to the very beginning of this story. If I haven't told you this already, I was compelled to teach this book. Originally, I was, several years ago, parachuted into someone's class. They were sick. I had a weekend or so to prepare this book. and it was quite a struggle and challenge. And for a long time, I was kind of wrestling with it. There's lots about it that I really don't like. And then there was a kind of hiatus, and I had to sort of rethink whether to carry on teaching the book. And it was this story that made me decide to. And specifically this first paragraph. "Let me begin," says Fawcett, "with some declarative statements. The Trojan horse was the most remarkable device built by the Mycenaean Greeks, and it is among the most devastating inventions in the history of language. Language is the most profound of all human inventions, the most flexible one, the most commonly used. It is our most carelessly maintained invention, and because of that, it has always been the most dangerous one, both to its users and to the planet." And that's it. In a nutshell, to use a metaphor, that is the ethos of this English 100 course. That's really what it's all about. So there we are. What I'm going to do in the final video for you is take you through the last 3 stories and talk to you a bit more about Marshall McLuhan, about the Global Village, and about how you should go about writing your essay. So more on that next time. Thank you very much, and I'll see you then.